In 2023, Africa received nearly $60 billion in foreign aid, yet almost 400 million people remain trapped in extreme poverty. If giving money is supposed to help, why does hardship keep growing? The world celebrated aid as a solution, but did the way these funds flow actually make Africa poorer? To understand this contradiction, we need to follow the money and uncover how good intentions unraveled into a global paradox. Each year, the scale of money flowing into Africa is measured in tens of billions. In 2023, official development assistance reached $59.7 billion, a figure that dwarfs the budgets of many countries. Yet, across the continent, poverty remains entrenched. More than 389 million Africans live on less than $2.15 a day, nearly 43% of the population. In Nigeria alone, more than 11% of the world's extreme poor struggle to survive, despite years of international support. The numbers reveal a jarring contradiction. Massive sums are intended to lift people out of hardship, yet daily life for millions remains defined by scarcity. Aid arrives with fanfare, press conferences, pledges, and promises of transformation. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. Crumbling infrastructure, overcrowded clinics, and empty classrooms are not relics of the past. They are part of daily life for families across Africa. The world's generosity is real, but so is the persistence of need. This paradox is not hidden in obscure statistics. It is visible in crowded markets where parents count every coin, in rural villages where children walk miles for clean water, and in city neighborhoods where joblessness is a constant threat. The money keeps coming, but the poverty numbers barely move. The question is no longer how much is given, but why so little changes. The answer lies not in the amount, but in the way the system works, and who truly benefits when billions cross borders. After World War II, Europe faced devastation on a scale rarely seen before. Cities lay in ruins, industries stalled, and millions struggled to rebuild their lives. Into this landscape, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, an ambitious effort that sent over $12 billion in aid between 1948 and 1952. But this was not just a transfer of money. The plan worked alongside governments with functioning bureaucracies, established legal systems, and a skilled workforce. Factories were repaired, railways restored, and local industries revived. By the early 1950s, Western Europe's economies were growing rapidly. The Marshall Plan's success rested on more than generous funding. It depended on strong institutions and a foundation of industrial capacity for recovery. When African countries began gaining independence in the late 1950s and the 1960s, the world's attention shifted. Many new nations entered the global stage with high hopes and urgent needs. Foreign aid soon followed, arriving in waves through the 1960s and the 1970s. Official development assistance brought promises of schools, clinics, and roads. Yet the context was profoundly different. Most African states inherited fragile institutions, thin administrative capacity, and economies built around a few raw materials. Colonial legacies left behind weak civil services and limited experience in managing complex national budgets. While aid poured in, the backbone that had supported Europe's recovery, industrial infrastructure, and effective governance, was often missing. The early years of African aid were marked by optimism, but also by the challenges of building states almost from scratch. With limited tax bases and little experience in large-scale economic planning, governments struggled to translate outside money into lasting growth. These early choices shaped the decades to come. Instead of fueling industrial expansion, much of the aid became a substitute for local revenue, making it harder for countries to build the strong institutions that drive development from within. In Uganda, a single audit changed everything. In 2012, investigators uncovered that over $12 million US, money provided by foreign donors to rebuild communities after conflict, had vanished from the office of the Prime Minister's accounts. The funds were meant for schools, health clinics, and roads in the north, where families were still recovering from years of turmoil. Instead, the money was quietly rerouted by senior officials, slipping through a network of personal accounts and shell companies. Village projects ground to a halt. In some communities, half-built classrooms stood empty, and promised clinics never opened their doors. The consequences reached far beyond missing infrastructure. When news of the diversion broke, major donors, Britain, Ireland, and Norway, immediately suspended all direct budget support to Uganda. The financial lifeline was cut, not just for the government, but for the families who depended on these services. Civil servants lost their jobs. Local leaders faced angry crowds demanding answers. Meanwhile, the officials at the heart of the scandal faced little more than brief suspensions and quiet transfers. This was not a story of a single theft, but of how easily large sums of aid can be absorbed into the machinery of government, redirected with a signature or a phone call. For every dollar lost, the cost was measured in children walking farther for school, mothers turned away from empty clinics, and entire villages left waiting for help that never arrived. The promise of aid became a source of frustration and distrust, as ordinary people watched resources meant for them disappear into the hands of a few. The system that was supposed to rebuild instead deepened the wounds left by conflict and poverty. In Nigeria, the promise of aid is often lost in a maze of paperwork and shadowy transactions. This pattern is a form of capture. Oluseun Onigbinda, a civil society investigator, spent years tracking how health sector grants meant for malaria and maternal care disappeared before reaching clinics. His team uncovered inflated contracts, simple medical supplies billed at double or triple their real value, with payments routed through ghost suppliers. When Onigbinde confronted officials with hard data in public forums, the response was mostly silence or vague denials. Occasionally, a scapegoat was punished, but the system itself remained untouched. The consequences ripple outward. Clinics run short on medicine, frontline workers go unpaid, and families are left to fend for themselves. The pattern is not limited to Nigeria. In Zambia, the collapse of Mulungushi textiles stands as a warning of how small-scale fraud can erode entire industries. Once a symbol of national pride, Mulungushi employed thousands and anchored the local economy. As procurement corruption spread, contracts were padded, machinery was left to rust, and inputs were siphoned off. Costs soared. At the same time, a flood of cheap secondhand clothing imports undercut domestic production. By 2006, the factory gates closed for good. Over 1,000 workers lost their jobs, and the town's economy unraveled. Manufacturing, once 15% of Zambia's gross domestic product in the 1980s, fell below 10% by the late 2010 OS. The decline was not inevitable. Studies point to mismanagement and procurement fraud as accelerants, turning competitive challenges into collapse. Onigbinda's work and Zambia's lost industry reveal a deeper problem. When aid and government spending are channeled through opaque systems, the result is not just lost money, but lost opportunity. Factories shutter, markets distort, and entire communities are left behind. In the 1980s and the 1990s, a new chapter began as international lenders stepped in with promises of reform. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank offered loans, but not without conditions. Governments were told to shrink their public sectors, cut spending, and privatize state-owned companies. These policies, called structural adjustment, aim to foster stability and growth. In practice, the results were far more complicated. Ministries slashed budgets for health, education, and public works. Thousands of civil servants lost their jobs, leaving key institutions understaffed and struggling to deliver basic services. The logic was simple: smaller states, less waste. But as governments downsized, their ability to collect taxes and manage development weakened. The very systems needed to turn aid into progress were hollowed out, leaving countries more dependent on outside money than before. A closer look at how aid is delivered reveals a fundamental design flaw. Empirical studies show that when governments receive large grants, their incentive to collect taxes weakens. Instead of building a broad tax base, leaders often rely on external money to fill budget gaps. This pattern is not unique to Africa, but its effects are especially stark where institutions are fragile. Meanwhile, a very different story played out in Asia. Countries like South Korea and Taiwan prioritized export-led growth, channeling resources into manufacturing and global trade. Their governments invested in strong institutions, demanded results, and used tax policy to drive development. The contrast is clear. Where grants replaced tax effort, growth faltered. Where domestic revenue and exports took center stage, economies transformed. Today, nearly $60 billion in aid flows into Africa each year, yet 389 million people still live in extreme poverty. Until foreign assistance empowers local institutions and true self-determination, cycles of dependence will persist. Real change begins when aid stops substituting for accountability. What kind of help actually builds genuine independence?